Before we begin, I want to offer a clear and firm warning. What you're about to hear contains graphic descriptions of violence, coercion, and abuse as detailed in open court during the federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs. These are not dramatizations, but actual testimony given under oath. Stories that may be deeply unsettling or triggering to some, especially to survivors of trauma or abuse. This content is intended for mature audiences only. Listener discretion is strongly advised. And remember, all individuals mentioned in this video, including Mr. Combs, are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. If you're joining us for the first time, full summaries for days 1 through 5 are available on the video tab of this channel. What follows is day number 6. Now let's begin day 6. Sean Diddy Combs trial. Dawn. Richard relives a nightmare. In the hushed federal courtroom, Dawn Richard, a former member of Combs' girl group Danity Kane, took the stand and painted a harrowing picture of violence. Richard testified that in 2009 she was at Combs' Los Angeles home when she witnessed an eruption of rage over something as trivial as breakfast. Cassie Ventura, Combs' then girlfriend, was frying eggs for him one morning when Combs came downstairs, cursing about where his food was. According to Richard's testimony, Combs grabbed a hot skillet and lunged as if to hit Ventura. Cassie fell to the floor, curling up in fear, and Combs started to punch and kick her. Richard recounted, voice shaking. "I had never seen anything like that before," she admitted. The courtroom fell silent as Richard described Cassie on the kitchen tile, arms shielding her head from Combs' blows. Even hardened trial observers seemed stunned by the visceral detail of the attack. The slow-burning tension in the room was palpable. Richard's account did not end with the beating. She recalled that the very next day Combs tried to normalize the violence. He summoned Richard and others back to his recording studio as if nothing happened. There, Combs casually explained that what Richard had seen, the outburst of fury in the kitchen, was simply what people in relationships do, and even handed out flowers to smooth things over, Richard testified. The almost surreal gesture of gifting flowers after a violent assault hung in the air of the courtroom. Jurors exchanged troubled glances at the notion that such brutality could be passed off as normal relationship behavior. Richard, a seasoned performer, appeared visibly unsettled on the stand as she relived the incident. She admitted that for years she tried to forget what she'd seen, only coming forward now under subpoena. On redirect examination, the prosecution gently asked why some of her memories had taken time to surface. Richard responded that she had tried to forget those dark moments. Working under Combs was a difficult environment and it was traumatic to relive it. She said she did tell prosecutors about the kitchen beating in every meeting they'd had, emphasizing that she had been pressured to stay quiet about it at the time. The implication was clear: fear and loyalty to the lucrative bad boy music empire kept many abuses behind closed doors until now. During cross-examination, defense attorney Nicole Westmoreland moved with a calculated calm, attempting to chip away at Richard's credibility. In a measured, almost conversational tone, Westmoreland questioned why Richard maintained contact with Combs even after allegedly fearing for her life. The jury learned that despite the terror, Richard says she felt she had reached out to Combs about working together again. "But then you ask him to come and work with him again?" The attorney pressed skeptically, referring to Richard's efforts to collaborate with Combs post Danity Kane. Richard conceded quietly that she did approach him again, an uncomfortable admission that hung in the air. The defense seized on this to suggest that Richard's fear of Combs might not have been as absolute as portrayed, or that her current testimony might be colored by other motives. Westmoreland then zeroed in on Richard's career fortunes. Under gentle but pointed questioning, Richard acknowledged that after leaving Combs' orbit, her solo musical efforts never matched the success she had while under his mentorship. The defense insinuated that resentment might lurk beneath her testimony. "You would agree he ruined your career not once but twice?" Westmoreland asked bluntly at one dramatic moment. Richard's eyes flashed as she responded, saddened by it. But ultimately, she admitted yes. She felt Combs had derailed her career. The tension in the courtroom rose with that admission. By drawing out Richard's lingering bitterness over professional slights, the defense subtly planted the idea that she might have an axe to grind. Westmoreland further implied that Richards' decision to file her own civil lawsuit against Combs in late 2024, shortly after Cassie Ventura filed hers, could be financially motivated. Richard firmly denied she was chasing a payout, insisting she only filed it because she wanted to be compensated for the work she did, not out of greed. The defense team also probed inconsistencies between Richards' courtroom testimony and prior statements. Westmoreland pointed out that Richards' initial lawsuit described the egg incident slightly differently, suggesting Combs threw eggs and set the pan aside rather than striking anyone with it. Under this methodical grilling, Richard admitted those descriptions differ in nuance, though she stood by the truth of what she recounted in court. When asked why some details, like an alleged threat Combs made that people go missing and appeared only in her more recent statements and not in earlier interviews, Richard explained that as time passed, her recollection gets better because it all took place so long ago. It was a striking illustration of how traumatic memories can resurface slowly, or as the defense hinted, how stories can potentially evolve. Through it all, Richard remained composed, though at times her frustration showed. She flatly denied that she has had any trouble keeping her story straight about the violent episodes, pushing back against the defense's insinuations of fabrication. By the end of Richard's testimony, the mood in the courtroom was heavy. Observers noted that her testimony added a first-hand corroboration of Ventura's allegations, an outsider who had seen the alleged abuse with her own eyes. For the prosecution, Richard's presence on day 6 was crucial in buttressing Cassie's 4 days of testimony with an independent witness account. For the defense, however, sowing doubt in Richard's motives was the order of the day, and they left the jury with subtle suggestions that this former protege might be a scorned ex-employee looking for payback. As the day continued, the prosecution called Carrie Morgan, once Cassie Ventura's closest friend, to the stand. Morgan stepped up hesitantly, a tall, poised woman who nonetheless radiated reluctance. In a low, matter-of-fact tone, she admitted at the outset, "We don't speak. Her boyfriend assaulted me," referring to Combs. The statement landed like a gut punch in the courtroom. Morgan made clear that she never wanted to be here recounting these events. She had moved on from all this. She sighed, visibly uncomfortable under the courtroom's gaze. But under oath, this former friend proceeded to deliver some of the trial's most chilling testimony yet, describing how the glamour of Cassie's world with Diddy was punctured by episodes of shocking violence. Morgan's narrative unfolded slowly, with long pauses as if she was sifting through painful memories. She described meeting Cassie as teens on the NYC modeling scene and remaining close for 17 years. When Cassie entered a relationship with the hip-hop mogul, Morgan initially saw her friend's life as exciting and privileged, but she also watched Cassie's spark fade over time. On the stand, Morgan recalled how Combs would supply Cassie with drugs, belittle her, and gradually isolate her. "She wasn't the same," Morgan said softly, referring to Cassie's personality under Combs' control. In fact, Morgan testified she had witnessed Combs physically assault Cassie on at least 2 occasions, one in Los Angeles and one during a tropical vacation, and heard of other incidents as well. Her most dramatic recollection centered on a trip to Jamaica in 2013 that began as a carefree girls' vacation and ended in terror. Morgan and Cassie, along with a few friends, were midway through a sun-soaked island holiday when Combs decided to fly in and join them unannounced. The atmosphere changed the moment Combs arrived. Morgan testified that one afternoon, Cassie slipped away to the master bedroom of their villa to use the bathroom. After only a few minutes, Combs grew impatient, agitated that Cassie was taking too long, and abruptly stormed off toward the bedroom. Moments later, a scream echoed through the house. Morgan sprinted toward the sound. What she saw next, she recounted in a steady but subdued voice, was the stuff of nightmares. "I saw him dragging her out of the master bedroom by her hair," Morgan said, her eyes fixed on a distant point as if still picturing the scene. The courtroom sketch artist's hand flew across the page as Morgan continued. Combs yanked Cassie by her hair with such force that when Cassie hit the ground, her head struck a brick stepped by the doorway. Cassie lay crumpled and motionless for 20 to 30 seconds, eyes closed. "I thought she'd been knocked out," Morgan said, her voice catching just slightly. Panicked, Morgan yelled at Combs, a risky move confronting a man she knew to be volatile, and then made a split-second decision. She grabbed her purse and phone, ready to flee with Cassie into the Jamaican night if necessary. Cassie regained consciousness with a jolt and, terrified, bolted into the surrounding brush, disappearing into the thick tropical foliage. Morgan testified that she and Combs split up to search for Cassie in the darkness. Morgan eventually found her traumatized friend hiding in a ditch, trembling and afraid to return. The two women huddled there for what felt like hours, though Morgan couldn't be sure how long. Time seemed to warp in that adrenaline-soaked moment. Eventually, cautiously, they crept back to the house once they believed Combs had calmed down. Listening to Morgan describe that frantic night, the hide-and-seek in the jungle with an enraged mogul stalking them, jurors sat riveted. One juror covered her mouth with a hand, another shook his head subtly as if in disbelief. Morgan's matter-of-fact delivery only amplified the horror of the story. She called the incident terrifying, an assessment that felt like an understatement. Morgan also spoke about a more recent confrontation in 2018 that ended her friendship with Cassie for good. In halting detail, she alleged that Sean Combs assaulted her that year, striking Morgan with a wooden clothes hanger during an altercation at Cassie's Los Angeles home. The blow was severe enough to give Morgan a concussion and leave her badly shaken. In the aftermath, as Morgan recovered from the dizzying injury, something in her friendship with Cassie shattered. Morgan testified that a short time later, Cassie unexpectedly offered her $30,000 and asked her to sign a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, about the incident. The hush in court deepened as Morgan described this meeting in a West Hollywood pizza shop. A pregnant pause hung between the old friends before Cassie slid a contract and check across the table. Morgan says she accepted the money and signed the NDA, but she viewed the payoff as a stinging betrayal. After that day, Morgan testified, the two haven't spoken since. The courtroom could sense Morgan's lingering hurt, not only from the assault by Combs, but from the loss of her best friend in such a cold, transactional manner. For Morgan, "I drew the line at physical abuse." She explained of her decision to cut ties after the hanger incident. She had stood by Cassie through years of tumult, but being personally attacked by the man her friend loved was the final straw. When it came time for cross-examination, defense attorney Mark Agnefello adopted a markedly polite and an even empathetic approach with Morgan. His tone was gentle, as if interviewing a colleague rather than grilling an adverse witness. More than once, he prefaced questions with, "I'm just trying to understand," and even apologized for probing sensitive topics. This tactful strategy seemed designed to avoid alienating the jury. Agnefello treated Morgan almost as an ally, perhaps recognizing that attacking Cassie's longtime friend too aggressively could backfire. With this calm demeanor, he led Morgan through a series of questions that subtly emphasized moments of normalcy and mutual affection in Cassie's relationship with Combs. Under Agnefello's questioning, Morgan acknowledged that Cassie and Combs had been in love, at least from her perspective, and that their feelings appeared genuine. He inquired about the good times, the lavish trips and parties Morgan attended as a guest of Cassie and Combs. Morgan conceded that they'd all enjoyed upscale vacations, Burning Man festivals, trips to Italy, and other luxury outings, often having fun together in Combs' presence. At some points, Agnefello noted Morgan had even advised Cassie to stay in their relationship. She admitted that while she sometimes urged Cassie to break up with Combs when things were bad, at other times she told her to remain with him, hoping perhaps that things would improve. These acknowledgments cast a more complex light on Cassie's situation, suggesting it wasn't nonstop horror, but a roller coaster of highs and lows that even her best friend struggled to navigate. It was a subtle reinforcement of the defense's theme, that this was a passionate but tumultuous romance, not a one-sided nightmare of captivity. Agnefello also homed in on the aftermath of the 2016 Los Angeles freak-off beating, an incident Cassie had detailed earlier in the trial, where she was allegedly beaten while trying to escape a sex party at the Intercontinental Hotel. Morgan wasn't present for the hotel incident, but she did arrive at Cassie's apartment shortly afterward, just in time for Combs to show up at Cassie's door wielding a hammer in anger. Morgan confirmed that the Los Angeles police eventually responded, perhaps alerted by a concerned neighbor hearing the commotion and found Cassie bruised with a black eye. On cross, Agnifilo asked Morgan to recount how Cassie behaved when officers questioned her. Morgan's testimony confirmed a telling detail. Cassie protected Combs even then, refusing to say a word about what happened. They asked what happened. She said nothing. She didn't respond, Morgan said, recalling how Cassie sat silent on her couch, deflecting the police inquiries. Even when officers asked Cassie for identification, she said she didn't have it. Morgan added, "This line of questioning buttressed the defense's argument that Cassie's own actions at times seemed inconsistent with someone who felt enslaved or desperate to escape. Why wouldn't she tell the police about abuse if it was truly non-consensual?" The flip side, which the prosecution would no doubt stress later, is that Cassie's silence was born of fear and manipulation, exactly what one would expect from a coercive dynamic. But Agnifilo's gentle cross sought to leave jurors with the image of Cassie choosing to shield Combs from consequences, possibly out of love or loyalty rather than sheer terror. Throughout this questioning, Carrie Morgan remained largely dispassionate and guarded. Observers noted that she spoke flatly and matter-of-factly, often declining to embellish or offer more than what was asked. When pressed for details she couldn't recall or didn't wish to expound on, Morgan simply demurred with statements like, "I'm not sure," or "I don't remember." And this restrained demeanor cut both ways. On one hand, it lent her an air of neutrality. She did not come off as someone eager to bury Combs, but rather as a reluctant participant sticking to facts as she remembered them. On the other hand, her reluctance to elaborate meant the jury got little additional emotional context from her beyond the stark descriptions of events. Some jurors watched her intently, perhaps searching for a crack in the stoic facade, but none appeared. Morgan's flat-affected self became a point of comment outside court. Was it trauma and fatigue, or a sign that she wished to distance herself from the whole ordeal? Either way, she did not appear vindictive. In fact, when Agnifilo questioned why Morgan never tried to reconcile with Cassie after 2018, Morgan sounded almost melancholic. "I don't know why she hasn't reached out to me," she said of Cassie, adding softly, "I'm sure she doesn't have the same number." The pain of losing her best friend was evident even if Morgan tried to hide it. By the end of Morgan's testimony, the jury had heard about years of alleged abuse from an outsider turned insider's perspective. Morgan's stories from Jamaica to Los Angeles portrayed Combs as mercurial, jealous, and terrifying, but also showed Cassie's conflicted loyalty and the complex reality that kept her ensnared. The prosecution seemed satisfied. Morgan had further corroborated a pattern of violence spanning years, reinforcing the case that Cassie's experiences were not isolated or exaggerated. The defense, meanwhile, had skillfully used Morgan's own words to highlight the gray areas: love, luxury, and loyalty intermingled with the violence. It was a slow burning exchange, rich in nuance, leaving jurors to ponder how to interpret a relationship that was by turns glamorous and brutal. David James speaks out. As afternoon shadows lengthened in the courtroom, the prosecution called its final witness of the day, David James, a former personal assistant to Sean Combs. James walked in with an air of earnest professionalism, dressed in a crisp suit, a contrast to the star power of previous witnesses. He worked closely with Combs from 2007 to 2009. During the early years of Combs' relationship with Cassie Ventura, if anyone could pull back the curtain on Combs' private world, it was this soft-spoken assistant who had been at the mogul's beck and call. The atmosphere in court shifted subtly. Jurors leaned forward, perhaps anticipating a behind-the-scenes look at the man behind the music empire. James did not disappoint, delivering a portrait of Combs' lavish yet controlling lifestyle that felt ripped from the pages of a thriller. James began by recounting how he landed the coveted job working for one of the biggest names in entertainment. In a remarkable anecdote, he said he applied after seeing a New York Times ad announcing that Bad Boy Entertainment's chairman was seeking a new assistant. During his interview at Combs' Manhattan office, James recalled an HR manager gesturing toward a large portrait of Combs on the wall. "This is Mr. Combs' kingdom," she told the young applicant bluntly. "We're all here to serve in it." The phrasing struck the courtroom like a clarion bell. Combs's kingdom. It encapsulated the power dynamic James would soon step into, a world where Sean Diddy Combs reigned supreme and everyone in his orbit was expected to cater to his whims. Jurors traded looks. The Kingdom anecdote painted Combs as a man who demanded fealty and subservience from his staff. It was a potent setup for James's further testimony about control and hierarchy. Once hired, James quickly learned just how all-consuming the job was. Combs's demands were ceaseless and spanned the mundane to the extravagant. James testified that his duties ranged from managing Combs's packed schedule to the most minute personal tasks, turning on his television, ensuring the in-house chef had Combs's meals prepared exactly as he liked, laying out his clothes, and generally anticipating his needs hour by hour. If Combs traveled, which he often did, James would sometimes accompany him. Though James didn't spill all the details of these writer demands in open court, the implication was clear. Combs expected a particular environment curated to his tastes wherever he went. Every aspect of daily life in Combs's kingdom was orchestrated to keep the mogul content. James's testimony shifted from describing this intense work environment to focusing on Cassie Ventura's place in that kingdom. As an assistant, James had a close view of the couple's early years. He recounted one telling conversation with Cassie during a work trip to Miami. Late one night, as they stepped outside to share a cigarette break, Cassie confided in him, "Man, this lifestyle is crazy," she sighed, referring to the whirlwind of constant travel, parties, and pressure that came with being by Combs's side. James, who was bone-tired himself from Combs's breakneck schedule, agreed wholeheartedly. It was clear to him that Cassie's life was as exhausting and frenetic as his own, if not more so. In that same conversation, James gently suggested to Cassie that if it was all too much, she might consider leaving the relationship for the sake of her sanity. Cassie's response, as James recalled it, was telling. She said she couldn't leave, or at least not easily, was because Combs controlled her life and her money, according to James's testimony. Cassie confided that nearly every aspect of her livelihood was tied to Combs. He was not only her boyfriend, but her label boss. She was signed to his Bad Boy Records, effectively her employer, and even provided her housing. Walking away would mean losing her record deal, her income, and her home in one fell swoop. "I just didn't think she could easily leave," James said, summarizing his understanding of Cassie's predicament. Those words landed heavily. Here was an insider confirming the prosecution's core narrative that Cassie Ventura was financially and emotionally bound to Combs, which undermines any notion that she was a free agent willingly engaging in the more lurid aspects of their life together. The jurors nodded almost imperceptibly as James spoke, absorbing this corroboration from a seemingly neutral party. James also recounted an incident that illuminated how Combs himself viewed Cassie. In a separate conversation around that time, Combs confided to James that he considered Cassie moldable. The mogul described the young singer-actress as someone he could shape to his liking. Hearing this term in court, moldable, sent a slight chill through the room. It echoed Cassie's own allegations that Combs groomed and controlled her, treating her as a pliable object of his will rather than an equal partner. James's testimony suggested that Combs openly saw Cassie as a project to be controlled, an admission that aligns with the prosecution's depiction of a dominant figure exerting near total power over a younger woman. While James spoke, Sean Combs sat at the defense table looking on intently, his expression inscrutable. Several times, Combs leaned over to jot notes, which he slid to his attorneys. One of those lawyers, Tenny Garagos, would occasionally pass the notes along to lead counsel Agnifilo. At no point did Combs betray any obvious emotion during James's revelations. If anything, his face hardened slightly at the mention of the kingdom comment and the description of Cassie as moldable. It was the face of a man used to control, now confronted with testimony about the extent of that control in a court of law. James went on to describe the culture of silence and obedience that prevailed in Combs's retinue. He testified that whenever he became too curious or asked too many questions about Combs's personal dealings, the security detail would quickly shut him down. Bodyguards warned James to stay in his lane, he said, a phrase he interpreted as do the job you were hired to do and only that job. In other words, don't meddle in the boss's affairs beyond your narrow duties. This anecdote reinforced the image of a tightly controlled environment where even senior staff understood that Combs's private life and darker impulses were off limits for discussion. It dovetailed with Richard's and Morgan's accounts of being told to keep quiet. Secrets were to be kept and questions not asked. For the jury, James's insider perspective likely added credibility to the notion that Combs orchestrated a kind of wall of secrecy around his actions, especially the unsavory ones. By 3:30 p.m., the court day was drawing to a close, and James had only begun to share his experiences. He was cut off mid-testimony as Judge Arun Subramanian announced the day's end, instructing the jury to return the next morning. David James is expected to continue on the stand Tuesday, where prosecutors will likely prompt him for more examples of Combs's influence over Cassie and perhaps the infamous freak-offs that lie at the heart of the case. Thus far, James's calm, meticulous testimony has strongly supported the prosecution's case theory that Sean Combs wielded near-total control over Cassie Ventura's life, creating the conditions under which the alleged sex trafficking and abuse could occur. The defense has yet to cross-examine James. When they do, we can anticipate a two-pronged approach. First, Combs' lawyers may attempt to show that Combs was a demanding boss but not a criminal, that having high standards and a lavish lifestyle doesn't equate to abusing or trafficking anyone. They may highlight that James never personally witnessed Combs forcing Cassie into non-consensual acts, or that James's knowledge of the more salacious freak-off events is secondhand. Second, the defense will likely scrutinize James's own motives and credibility. Is there any bad blood from his time working for Combs? James did note he originally aspired to break into fashion through Combs' connections. Perhaps the defense will explore whether that dream was unfulfilled. Could James be embellishing his account out of loyalty to Cassie or for a taste of the spotlight? These are angles the defense has in its toolkit. For now, however, James's testimony ended on a strong note for the prosecution, underscoring how Combs' dominance permeated every level of his entourage and relationship. Notably, by day 6, the cumulative effect of testimony from Cassie Ventura over 4 days, Don Richard, Kerry Morgan, and David James is painting a consistent narrative that Sean Diddy Combs orchestrated a pattern of sexual, physical, and psychological abuse behind a facade of glamour. Federal prosecutors are methodically focusing on this pattern of violence and control to convince jurors that Cassie's participation in lurid acts was not truly voluntary. Combs, 55, faces serious federal charges: racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, and multiple counts of transporting individuals across state lines for prostitution, charges he vehemently denies. If convicted on all counts, he could spend decades in prison. By the time Judge Subramanian's gavel signaled the day's end, everyone in the courtroom seemed to exhale at once, as if realizing they'd been holding their breath through each gripping testimonial.